In the world of aviation, safety is everything. It's a delicate balance of trust, engineering, and human lives. But what if the very systems we rely on are not as safe as we think? What if someone within the system uncovered a flaw so catastrophic it could endanger thousands of people, and when they tried to expose it, no one listened? This is the story of a man who worked for years within one of the largest and most influential corporations in the world, Boeing. A man who thought he was simply doing his job, ensuring quality, until one day he stumbled across something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the aviation industry. Something so dangerous that it could threaten the lives of millions of passengers. A flaw in one of the most popular aircraft, the 737 MAX, that, if left unchecked, could cause a catastrophic disaster. He saw it, understood the implications, and realized that exposing it could not only destroy his career but put him in the crosshairs of a powerful corporation that would stop at nothing to protect its reputation. This man could have walked away. He could have ignored the signs, turned a blind eye, and stayed in the safety of his position. But instead, he did what so many people would never dare to do: he spoke up. He raised the alarm, warning his superiors, the people who were supposed to be the stewards of safety, about the deadly flaw. He knew the risks, he knew what would happen if they didn't act. He knew that lives were at stake. But his voice, like so many others before him, was drowned out. The very people who were supposed to listen, to take action, chose to ignore him. He wasn't celebrated for his bravery. Instead, he found himself alone, ostracized, his career destroyed, and his warnings buried beneath layers of corporate red tape. Despite the evidence, despite the undeniable danger, he was pushed aside, his concerns dismissed, and his reputation tarnished. The corporation's silence was deafening, and in the end, they tried to erase him. Then, just months after his courageous attempt to expose the truth, something happened. A tragic and unexpected event. The man, who had stood up against the system, was found dead. Was it an accident? A random, unforeseeable event? Or was there something more to his death, something that the company and the powers that be don't want us to know? This is the chilling story of a whistleblower whose life was cut short in the most mysterious of ways, just after he revealed a truth that could have rocked the very foundation of the aviation industry. Was his death a tragic coincidence, or was it a carefully orchestrated move to silence him forever? His family, his friends, his colleagues, they all had one question. What really happened? Was he just another casualty in the battle between truth and power, or did his death represent something far more sinister? Stick with me, and we'll piece together the puzzle of this man's life, his dangerous discovery, and the tragic events that followed. Together, we'll uncover the hidden truths that were buried with him and ask the question, who really paid the price for exposing Boeing's deadly secret? He wasn't just any employee. He was one of the best in his field, a man with an impeccable reputation and a work ethic that earned him the trust and respect of his colleagues. For years, he had been a dedicated engineer at Boeing, one of the world's largest and most prestigious aircraft manufacturers. To him, this wasn't just a job, it was a responsibility, a calling. After all, every calculation he made, every decision he signed off on, directly impacted the lives of countless passengers who stepped onto a Boeing aircraft. Let's call him John for now. A name as ordinary as his appearance, but behind that unassuming exterior was a man who had spent decades perfecting his craft. John knew every nut and bolt of the planes he worked on. He understood the complex systems that kept them in the air and the risks involved if even the smallest detail was overlooked. To him, safety wasn't just a part of the job, it was the foundation of everything he did. In the world of aviation, there's no room for error. John knew this better than anyone. The margins for mistakes are razor thin, and a single oversight can result in tragedy. It was this understanding that kept him working late nights, double-checking designs, and advocating for stricter safety protocols, even when it made him unpopular among his peers. He was meticulous, perhaps even overly cautious, but that's what made him so good at his job. For years, John operated under the assumption that he was part of a system that valued safety above all else. He believed in the mission of the company, that Boeing was committed to producing the safest aircraft in the world. But over time, he started to notice cracks in the facade. Small things at first, decisions made in the interest of cost-cutting rather than quality, deadlines pushed forward with little regard for the time needed to ensure every component was up to standard. He told himself it was the nature of the business, that every company faced pressure to meet financial targets. But then came the 737 MAX, a plane that was supposed to be Boeing's crowning achievement. John was part of the team that worked on the MAX, and from the beginning, he had his doubts. The company was racing against the clock to beat their competitor, Airbus, to market with a more fuel-efficient design. The pressure to deliver was immense, and corners were being cut left and right. Engineers were told to streamline processes, to focus on speed rather than thoroughness. Managers emphasized deadlines over details, and when concerns were raised, they were quickly brushed aside. John didn't want to believe it at first. After all, this was Boeing, a company synonymous with quality and reliability. But as the project progressed, he found it harder and harder to ignore the warning signs. There were discrepancies in the data, reports that didn't add up, and systems that seemed dangerously underdeveloped. One system, in particular, caught his attention, the MCOS, or Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. Designed to help stabilize the plane during certain maneuvers, it was a critical component of the 737 MAX. But John noticed flaws in the system's design that could lead to catastrophic failures under the right, or rather, wrong, circumstances. He brought his concerns to his supervisors, expecting them to take immediate action. But instead of addressing the issues, they dismissed them, assuring him that the MCOS had been thoroughly tested and was good enough for certification. Good enough. Those words haunted him. In aviation, good enough isn't supposed to exist. Every system, every piece of equipment, has to be perfect because lives depend on it. John wasn't satisfied with their response. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, that the flaws in the MCOS were more dangerous than anyone was willing to admit. He started conducting his own research, gathering evidence to support his claims. The more he uncovered, the more alarmed he became. But with every piece of evidence he presented, the pushback grew stronger. His colleagues warned him to drop it, to stop asking questions. His supervisors accused him of overreacting, of being a perfectionist who couldn't see the bigger picture. Still, John couldn't let it go. He knew that speaking up would put his career at risk, but the thought of staying silent was even worse. If something happened, if a plane went down because of the MCOS, he would never forgive himself. So, he made the decision that would change his life forever. He became a whistleblower. John wasn't a man of half measures. When he decided to speak up about the issues with the MCOS system, he did so with the conviction of someone who believed in the principles he'd built his life around. His first step was internal. He drafted a detailed report outlining the design flaws in the MCOS, supported by data and simulations he had conducted. The report was thorough, professional, and impossible to ignore, at least, that's what he thought. He submitted it to his immediate supervisor, expecting it to be escalated up the chain of command. But days turned into weeks, and he heard nothing. When he finally followed up, the response was a carefully worded dismissal. "We appreciate your concerns, John, but the system has already been cleared for certification. There's no need to revisit it." John wasn't deterred. He requested a meeting with higher-level executives, hoping to bypass the bureaucracy that seemed intent on sweeping his concerns under the rug. The meeting was scheduled, but when the day came, it was clear the executives weren't there to listen. They nodded politely as he presented his findings, but their questions were vague, their interest superficial. One executive even hinted that John's insistence was becoming a distraction from the company's objectives. Still, John pressed on. He updated his report, adding more evidence and even proposing solutions to address the MCOS flaws. He sent it to the FAA, believing that the regulatory body would step in where Boeing had failed. But the FAA's response was just as disheartening. Whether due to bureaucracy, pressure from Boeing, or a simple unwillingness to dig deeper, they assured him that the system met the necessary safety standards. It didn't take long for John to realize he'd crossed an invisible line. Almost overnight, his once friendly work environment turned hostile. Colleagues who had worked alongside him for years began avoiding him. Meetings he was once integral to were now held without him. Projects he'd been leading were reassigned without explanation. The message was clear: John was no longer part of the team. The retaliation escalated. His performance reviews, once glowing, were suddenly filled with vague criticisms. He was accused of being difficult to work with and out of touch with company priorities. Opportunities for advancement evaporated. It was as if his entire career was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. But the worst was yet to come. One morning, John arrived at work to find a formal letter waiting on his desk. It accused him of violating company policy by sharing proprietary information, an accusation he knew was unfounded but devastating nonetheless. The letter ended with a chilling ultimatum: resign quietly or face termination. John refused to back down. He sought legal counsel and filed a whistleblower complaint, hoping the law would protect him. But Boeing had deep pockets and a powerful legal team. The company's response was swift and aggressive, painting John as a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta. They questioned his motives, his professionalism, even his mental health. With every door inside the company slammed shut, John made the decision that would seal his fate. He went public. He contacted journalists, shared his evidence, and told his story to anyone who would listen. It was a move of sheer desperation, but also immense courage. He knew the risks. By going public, he wasn't just taking on Boeing, he was challenging an entire industry and its intricate web of power and influence. At first, the media was hesitant. Boeing was a giant, and few were willing to take on the potential legal and financial repercussions of investigating the company. But eventually, a small investigative journalism team decided to run with the story. They published an exposé detailing the flaws in the 737 MAX MCOS system and the company's refusal to address them. The article included John's account, though he chose to remain anonymous at the time. The story made waves, but it wasn't enough to force change. Boeing issued a carefully worded statement denying the allegations and reaffirming their commitment to safety. They painted John as a lone dissenter, an outlier whose views didn't reflect the reality of the 737 MAX development process. And for a while, it seemed like the company's narrative would prevail. While Boeing was busy protecting its image, John's personal life was unraveling. The stress of the ordeal began to take a toll on his health. He suffered from insomnia, anxiety, and a constant sense of paranoia. He started receiving anonymous threats, emails warning him to stop his crusade against Boeing. One day, his car was vandalized, the word traitor scratched into the paint. His family wasn't spared either. His wife, who had supported him through thick and thin, began to question whether the fight was worth it. Their savings were draining rapidly, consumed by legal fees and the cost of living after John lost his job. His children, too young to fully understand the situation, became targets of whispers and judgment in their community. The once stable foundation of his life was crumbling beneath him. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, the unthinkable happened. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610, a Boeing 737 MAX, crashed into the Java Sea shortly after takeoff, killing all 189 people on board. The world was shocked, but for John, it was a nightmare come true. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the MCOS system was to blame. In the days following the crash, John's phone didn't stop ringing. Journalists, lawyers, and regulators all wanted to hear from him. He agreed to speak, hoping that the tragedy would finally force the industry to confront the truth. But instead of vindication, he faced even more backlash. Boeing doubled down on its denials, and the FAA remained conspicuously silent. Meanwhile, John became the target of a coordinated smear campaign, his name dragged through the mud in both the press and private industry circles. For a while, it seemed like the worst was over for John. He had lost his career, endured a smear campaign, and sacrificed almost everything to get the truth out. The crash of Lion Air Flight 610 had shaken the aviation world, and while Boeing continued its denials, John hoped that the mounting public scrutiny would lead to change. But just as the dust began to settle, something unexpected happened. It started innocently enough. John began to experience fatigue that he brushed off as the result of stress and sleepless nights. He had been under immense pressure for months, years, really, and his body was finally feeling the strain. At least, that's what he told himself. But soon, the symptoms escalated. The fatigue turned into persistent headaches, muscle weakness, and a nagging cough that wouldn't go away. At first, he avoided seeking medical help. He had no health insurance after being terminated from Boeing, and his savings were already drained from legal battles and supporting his family. But when his symptoms worsened, when his vision blurred, his balance faltered, and he began experiencing unexplained fevers, his wife insisted he see a doctor. The initial diagnosis was inconclusive. Doctors ran a battery of tests but couldn't pinpoint the cause of his illness. Stress, one physician suggested, can manifest in physical symptoms like these. Another doctor hinted that John's age might be a factor, though he was only in his mid-40s and had been in good health prior to the ordeal with Boeing. But John's condition continued to deteriorate. Within weeks, he lost a noticeable amount of weight. His once steady hands now trembled uncontrollably. He began to suffer from bouts of confusion, forgetting basic details or repeating himself in conversations. His wife grew increasingly alarmed, urging him to undergo more extensive testing. Finally, doctors identified an infection, one that seemed to have spread to multiple organs. But how had it taken hold so quickly? And why wasn't his body responding to treatment? These questions lingered, even as John's health declined further. His family was desperate for answers, but the medical professionals could offer little beyond speculation. The family began to wonder if John's illness was more than a coincidence. Could it be linked to the relentless stress and harassment he had endured? The anonymous threats, the smear campaigns, the legal battles, had they pushed his body past its breaking point? Or was there something more sinister at play? John himself began to voice his suspicions. "This doesn't feel natural," he told his wife one night as he lay in bed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've felt tired before. I've been sick before. But this feels different." His words haunted her long after he drifted off to sleep. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating among the few allies John had left. A former colleague reached out with a cryptic message: "Be careful, John. There are people who don't want the full story to come out." Another journalist who had covered John's whistleblowing efforts suggested that some powerful figures might have a vested interest in silencing him for good. John's decline was heartbreakingly swift. By the time he was admitted to the hospital, he was too weak to stand on his own. He spent his final days surrounded by his family, his once strong voice reduced to a faint murmur. Despite his condition, he remained lucid enough to impart one last message to his wife: "Don't let them bury the truth." On a cold February morning, John passed away. The official cause of death was listed as complications from an aggressive infection. But for those who knew him, the timing felt far too convenient. How could a man in the prime of his life, with no pre-existing conditions, succumb so suddenly and completely? For John's family, his death was more than a tragedy, it was a puzzle they couldn't piece together. His wife, grief-stricken but resolute, began to dig into the events leading up to his illness. She compiled every threatening email, every strange encounter, every moment that felt off in the months before his decline. What she found raised even more questions. One email, sent just weeks before his symptoms began, warned John to drop the act before it's too late. Another, sent anonymously, contained no text, just a link to an article about a whistleblower in another industry who had met an untimely end. And then there was the car vandalism incident, which now seemed less like a random act and more like a calculated warning. The family hired a private investigator, but the trail was cold. No fingerprints on the threatening emails. No surveillance footage from the night of the vandalism. No concrete evidence to suggest foul play. And yet, the coincidences were too many to ignore. In the weeks following John's death, speculation ran rampant. Journalists revisited his story, questioning whether his whistleblowing efforts had made him a target. Online forums buzzed with theories, some pointing to corporate espionage, others to more shadowy forces. But without hard evidence, the truth remained elusive. Boeing, for its part, issued a brief statement expressing condolences to John's family. But they made no mention of his whistleblowing efforts, nor did they acknowledge the role he had played in raising awareness about the MCOS flaws. To the public, he was just another former employee who had passed away too soon. In the years since John's death, the questions surrounding his illness have never been fully answered. Was it simply the result of prolonged stress, compounded by a weakened immune system? Or was there a deliberate effort to silence him once and for all? For those who knew John, the answer seems clear. He wasn't just a man who fell ill, he was a man who stood up to a powerful system and paid the ultimate price. His story serves as a haunting reminder of the risks whistleblowers take to expose the truth and of the unanswered questions that sometimes linger long after they're gone. When the news of John's death broke, the public response was muted. A handful of news outlets ran brief obituaries describing him as a former aviation safety engineer who had passed away from a tragic illness. They didn't mention the whistleblowing, the threats, or the years he spent fighting for the truth. To most, John was just another statistic, a name soon to be forgotten. But for those closest to him, the story was far from over. His wife, his children, and the few allies who had stood by him were left grappling with a profound sense of loss and a mountain of unanswered questions. Had John's death truly been natural, or had he become the latest casualty in a system designed to silence dissenters? Boeing issued a statement of condolence, carefully worded to avoid acknowledging John's whistleblowing efforts. "We are deeply saddened by the loss of a former member of our team," the statement read. "Our thoughts are with his family during this difficult time." But there was no mention of his role in uncovering the MCOS flaws, no acknowledgement of his warnings, and certainly no admission of guilt. For the company, the timing of John's death was convenient. The controversy surrounding the 737 MAX was beginning to subside. Settlements with the families of crash victims were being quietly negotiated. Regulators were allowing the planes back into the skies after software updates. John's death removed one of the most vocal critics from the equation, and Boeing seemed eager to move forward. But their silence spoke volumes to those who had followed John's story. If they had nothing to hide, one of his former colleagues remarked, why wouldn't they acknowledge the role he played in exposing the truth? Why wouldn't they honor his contributions? After John's death, his wife attempted to seek justice, not only for her husband but for the countless lives affected by the 737 MAX crashes. She reached out to lawyers, advocacy groups, and journalists, hoping to keep his story alive. But she quickly discovered the barriers standing in her way. Corporate whistleblowers in the United States are protected under laws like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the Dodd-Frank Act. But these laws are often toothless in practice, especially when powerful corporations can afford armies of lawyers. John's family learned this the hard way. The lawsuits he had filed against Boeing for wrongful termination were dismissed on technicalities. The settlement he had hoped to win to secure his family's future was never realized. Even the circumstances surrounding his death were difficult to investigate. The infection that claimed his life was officially attributed to natural causes, and without clear evidence of foul play, authorities had no grounds to pursue further inquiries. "It feels like they've won," his wife said in an interview. "They took everything from him, and now they're trying to erase his legacy." As the weeks turned into months, the questions surrounding John's death only grew louder. Some of his allies pointed to the anonymous threats he had received in the months before his illness. Others speculated about the timing of his symptoms, which seemed to align suspiciously with his most vocal public appearances. He wasn't just sick, one journalist argued. He was silenced. Whether it was intentional or not, the stress, the isolation, the retaliation, it all adds up. They didn't have to poison him or attack him physically. They just had to destroy his life and let the rest take its course. The theory gained traction online, where conspiracy forums and advocacy groups dissected every detail of John's story. Was it possible that his illness had been induced in some way, through exposure to toxic substances, perhaps, or as a result of psychological warfare? The lack of concrete evidence only fueled the speculation. John's wife refused to let his death be forgotten. She began to speak out, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. She published excerpts from his emails, detailing the threats and harassment he had endured. She partnered with advocacy groups to push for stronger whistleblower protections. And she continued to press for answers about the circumstances of his death. Her efforts brought some attention back to the case. A documentary filmmaker reached out, offering to create a series about John's life and the cost of whistleblowing. Journalists began revisiting the Boeing 737 MAX scandal, using John's story as a lens to examine corporate accountability. But the fight took a toll on her as well. Financially drained and emotionally exhausted, she struggled to balance her activism with raising her children and coping with her grief. John's story became a symbol of a much larger issue, the high cost of speaking out against powerful institutions. Advocacy groups used his case to highlight the need for stronger whistleblower protections, pointing out that John was far from the only one to suffer such a fate. Across industries, from finance to healthcare to tech, whistleblowers face similar retaliation, isolation, and, in some cases, mysterious deaths. John's death is part of a pattern, one activist said. These corporations don't just ignore whistleblowers, they destroy them. And the system lets it happen because it's easier to silence one person than to hold an entire industry accountable. Despite these efforts, change was slow. Laws were proposed but stalled in Congress. Public attention shifted to new scandals. And for John's family, the sense of injustice remained. To this day, no one has been held accountable for John's death. The medical records remain sealed. The company continues to operate without acknowledging his contributions. And the questions his family and allies have raised remain unanswered. Was John a victim of corporate greed, or was his death simply the tragic result of stress and illness? Did someone deliberately target him, or was he merely caught in the crossfire of a much larger battle? The answers may never be known. But while the truth remains elusive, John's legacy endures. His warnings about the MCOS system saved countless lives, forcing changes that made the skies safer. His courage inspired others to speak out, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And his story serves as a reminder of the human cost of exposing the truth. In the end, John's life was a testament to the power of one voice. Though silenced, his message continues to resonate, challenging us all to ask the difficult questions and to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. His name was Joshua Dean. A man born into a humble, middle-class family in Ohio, Joshua had always been drawn to the skies. As a child, he spent hours building model airplanes, dreaming of a future where he could play a role in making air travel safe for everyone. That dream led him to Purdue University, where he graduated with honors in aerospace engineering. His professors described him as diligent, a problem solver, and above all, a man who cared deeply about the lives his work would touch. Joshua's first job out of college was with a small aviation firm, where he quickly earned a reputation for his meticulous attention to detail. But it wasn't until he joined Boeing in 2005 that he found himself at the center of one of the greatest controversies in modern aviation history. For years, Joshua worked tirelessly in the company's safety and engineering division. He was known as the go-to guy for solving complex problems and was even commended by his superiors for his ability to think outside the box. But behind the scenes, the company was undergoing a transformation. Profit margins were prioritized over safety, and shortcuts became the norm. For Joshua, this was deeply unsettling. When he discovered the flaws in the MCOS system, Joshua initially believed that the issue could be fixed internally. His faith in the company's commitment to safety was unwavering until it wasn't. The more he pushed for change, the more resistance he met. His concerns were dismissed, his reports buried, and his warnings ignored. The full weight of Joshua's actions became clear when he decided to go public. The lawsuits, the anonymous threats, the surveillance, it all pointed to one thing: the company saw him as a threat. And yet, Joshua never stopped fighting. Even as his health deteriorated, he continued to speak out, believing that the truth was more important than his own comfort or safety. When Joshua passed away, his family was left with more questions than answers. His wife found herself combing through his old emails and notes, piecing together the final days of a man who had given everything for the truth. What she uncovered was both heartbreaking and enraging: detailed accounts of retaliation, evidence of his deteriorating health, and a man who felt increasingly isolated but unwavering in his commitment to doing the right thing. Joshua's story isn't just about one man, it's about the unseen network of whistleblowers who risk everything to expose the truth. For every Joshua Dean, there are countless others whose names we'll never know. People who have faced retaliation, threats, and even death for daring to challenge the systems that betray public trust. In the aftermath of Joshua's death, a small group of his colleagues began to speak out. They shared stories of similar issues they had uncovered, hinting at a culture of systemic negligence within the company. These individuals, inspired by Joshua's courage, refused to let his sacrifice go unnoticed. As the camera pans to Joshua's grieving wife and children, the real question lingers: who benefits when whistleblowers are silenced? The company avoided admitting fault, the regulators moved on, and the public, for the most part, forgot. But the planes Joshua fought to make safer still fly today, carrying millions of passengers who remain blissfully unaware of the battle waged on their behalf. The system isn't broken, one of Joshua's former colleagues said in a rare interview. It's working exactly as intended, to protect those at the top, no matter the cost. Joshua Dean's story is one of bravery, sacrifice, and the often unbearable cost of doing what's right. His name may not be etched in history books, but his legacy lives on in the lives he saved and the conversations he sparked. Now, the question turns to you. What would you do if faced with a similar choice? Could you risk everything to expose the truth, knowing it might cost you your career, your reputation, or even your life? The price of truth is steep, but the cost of silence can be even greater. Share this story. Discuss it with others. And most importantly, honor the whistleblowers who continue to fight battles most of us will never see. Thank you for watching. This has been the Whistleblower Files. Subscribe for more stories about the hidden heroes who dared to speak out. Because as long as there are people willing to risk everything, there's still hope for accountability.